There's something that happens when you read, in the beginning was the Word. It's like a longship crunching through ice. It's so powerful. But on the other hand, when I'm gathered round a fire on a Dartmoor night, I want to hear the stories of the wild Galilee druid, and I want to hear about him calming the waters of the lake, and just tell me the old stories as if it happened to you this morning, because it did happen to you this morning. That's why we remember this stuff, because Jesus is nothing to do with a long time ago, really. No, he's nothing to do with a long time ago. He's to do with the frightening present and what he is asking of us. Okay, I moved, so I can't say any more about that right now. Hello there and welcome to Jawbone. I can see that visually I'm starting to represent a kind of medieval painting. This isn't the drama department pushing out the budget. This is actually what it looks like in Dartmoor on the afternoon. Light comes down very quick. So I'm going to respond to a few questions today. I have not overthought them ahead of time. We shall see what we've got. If you like it and you want to send me a question, send one along and I'll try and respond in a future episode. So what have we got? From Steve O. Hello, Steve. There seems to be a movement away from an Enlightenment era thinking towards the embracing of metaphysical realities other than the materialist. However, not everyone is flocking to Christianity or even other traditional religions. What do you think are some of the long-term implications of this diverse re-enchantment? I think a long-term implication probably would be confusion. Because I think enchantment is kind of easy to come across, especially with the panorama, the smorgasbord, the tyranny of choice we now have for all sorts of psychedelic experiences that are going to flip open the top of our head, often without the cultural holding or tribal understanding of something like ayahuasca or San Pedro vine or salva divinorum or datura. These are extraordinarily powerful, healing, hellish, medicinal journeys that I whistle through my teeth at the implications of them being brought into a culture as adolescent as our own, without elders around them. I don't really like the word enchantment. I never did. I mean, I understand it. I do understand it, but I feel that our culture is already so enchanted, so trance-stated. I never see my teacher, I never see Jesus really as an enchanter. I can't imagine being enchanted by him. I imagine being in a fairly alarming state of waking up with an enormous amount of compassion attached, but woken up. So yeah, my thought I suppose is twofold actually, as I gather it. One is, I do think people want a deeper life. I think people want a life with qualities in it of substance and integrity even, that we as human beings are wired for, that social media doesn't seem to cater for or even understand. We are just on a kind of manic march towards endless superficial pleasure that is described as beauty but isn't really, because beauty always asks something from us and religious experience always asks something from us in the end. So to be enchanted, I would be a more sober fellow than that actually when you really get to know me, and I would worry that what is out there on offer outside of, I have to say, my own Christian tradition. I don't know about all the others necessarily, but I would have a concern that you'd be building your house on the sand, not on the rock, because you need a certain sobriety, you need a discipline to make a life that has substance and wonder in it. Imagination is a very fetishized term at the moment. I use it myself all the time, but also to be a great rememberer is really important. That's part of what orthodoxy is all about, your capacity to be steadfast with one hand and spiritually restless, open to the Holy Spirit with the other. So I think we're wired as creaturely human beings who have some distant memory of the garden, some distant memory of Eden, no matter how convoluted. In the end, there will always, and in a way, in a fashion, this will have been going on since the 1960s, since that first Dionysian uproar towards something that feels more truthful about the conditions of living. Well, the conditions of living have sorrow in them. And you can't have an enchantment of the positive without it having the Creator's tears in it, because that is part of what we are living through. It's part of the notion of the fall. So anything that is too ecstatic, anything that is too up in the air, anything that lacks what I would call the Jasconius depths, the underworld depths, the St. John of the Cross depths that Christian experience actually offers, I think in the end is going to make you feel maybe that you've been spun around like a dervish a few times, but can you grow corn from it? That is the great question. That is the perennial question. That is always an elder's position. They watch us toddlers from a distance and they say, well, are they making honey from their failures? You know. So that would be my first response to the first question. So from Andrea S., how can Christians recover a robust mythology of Christ without abandoning the historical? Well, I wouldn't wish to abandon the historical for a fraction of a second. And as soon as you do, you've lost the tension, you've lost the cross, actually. You've lost the cosmic Christ coming this way, and you've lost the historical Christ coming this way. And it is the combination of those things, and that as Christians we live in the tension of the opposites, that makes him the Messiah. You know, otherwise you remove the historicity and he's melted into a smorgasbord of ornamental sages and teachers throughout the world for thousands of years. And that's where most people want to put him. But no, I would lose the historicity of Christ at your peril. Mark is very good for bringing you into the shamanic reality of life on the road with Jesus Christ. Read that. But as some say, the Gospel of Mark tells you what Christ did, but then the Gospel of John, very popular with the early Irish, tells you why he did it. So that's in John, you move into the great philosophical, metaphysical range of what Jesus was about. And as Christians know, tonally, what he has to say really changes in John's gospel, especially that last week in Jerusalem, which is where all the action really is with John. He moves from those kind of koan-like parables designed partially, I think, to melt your head, that have a lot of agricultural or fishing references, into this big mythological world when he is pushing his way towards Calvary. You know, before Abraham, I am. You know, that's fighting talk. You know, that's the world turned upside down. You combine that with bringing people back from the dead. You combine that with everything that he was up to. There's a reason why there's a shockwave that's been reverberating for the last 2,000 years. So we don't need to get rid of the historicity of Christ, but I think there is an argument, and this is very prevalent in Christians across the board at the moment. I read this with my Catholic friends and Franciscans and Orthodox, the cosmological side of Christ is vital, and it's part. If there is a notion of enchantment worthy of the salt, that is the notion, as far as I can tell, that we would be, as Paul says, falling into the mind of Christ, that we are ordinary mystics. That, William Blake always said, you can't be a Christian and not be an artist, because God just opens up your head to beholding consciousness. You can't be a Christian without being a mystic, because just settling on the creed is so profoundly mystical. You don't have to be out in the desert, you can inhabit that consciousness wherever you live, but you have to take it seriously. So I wouldn't want the historicity without the mythology. As a storyteller, one of the difficult things about telling stories from the Bible is, ironically, you come up against one of the great powers of the Bible, which is its chapter and verse type pathos and impact. It's the difference between scripture and storytelling. And sometimes those things can mix, and sometimes they they can create a kind of tension in the room. There's something that happens when you read, in the beginning was the Word. I don't need that to be told to me in 50 different ways or less formally. So that has that kind of, it's like a long ship crunching through ice. It's so powerful. But on the other hand, when I'm gathered round a fire on a Dartmoor night, I want to hear the stories of the wild Galilee druid, and I want to hear about him calming the waters of the lake, and just tell me the old stories as if it happened to you this morning, because it did happen to you this morning. That's why we remember this stuff, because Jesus is nothing to do with a long time ago, really. No, he's nothing to do with a long time ago. He's to do with the frightening present and what he is asking of us. Okay, I'm moved, so I can't say any more about that right now. How do you balance the reading of contemporary material with the study of classics, both works you have read and haven't got to yet? I probably don't balance them, because I live in a place inside my head. You meet me and we start to talk, and we walk to the end of my yard, and the end of my yard, there is a doorway open to the medieval, and we will walk through that medieval courtyard, and then we will fall into a well, Conla's well, and at the bottom of that well we will be eaten by salmon, and the salmon will then spit us out at a little stream just outside the Avebury Stone Circle, and we will crawl out, the same but different, and we'll put our thumb out, and a truck will pick us up and take us to the London Museum, where we will find ourselves walking around the Department of Ancient Persia. And then when we've finished at the London Museum, there will be a Russian carriage outside, and we'll get in that Russian carriage, and it'll take us all the way to the furthest outpost where waiting for us is St. Seraphim. So that's the way my mind works. It's an ancient mind in a way. There is an old lad that lives in me, and it's the old girl or the old lad in you I'm always trying to talk to. It's the Lascaux in you. I'm not great for the future, although I think that most stories that are worth knowing about, we remember them because in a strange way they're going to happen in the future too. So I don't balance them. I don't read many novels. I just read where my heart takes me. I do have a big library, and every book in my library earns its keep. That's for sure. They are not ornamental. As a mythologist and storyteller in the Orthodox Church, can you talk about how you approach icons and hagiography? Well, my relationship with icons would be very physical. I kiss icons. I carry icons. I often have icons even maybe in my pocket. Icons are wonderful because I grew up not reading stories so much of the Bible, but looking at the pictures, looking at the images, and often what I remember and all sorts of wisdoms are contained in images, especially for cultures where not everybody could read. going into a church and seeing these stories illustrated on the wall, that's how you maybe learnt the story. You didn't have lots and lots of time to pick over it line by line. You'd hear a bit sung to you or chanted to you, and then you'd pick up some of the rest by the icons. It's been said in Russia in the time of communism, if one icon could have remained, then that church could have rebuilt itself from that one icon, the kind of treasury of wisdom that is coming through it. Now, I'm a modern painter, and I like modern painters like Cy Twombly and Anthony Tapias and the abstract expressionists. I swoon for their work, and they tell me a lot about the fall. They tell me a lot about the beautiful wreckage of modern life, but the icons do something a bit different to me. They alert me to metaphysical realities. They alert me to eternity. And although visually they weren't something that I really responded to as a sort of an aesthetic, in my religious life now, they are gorgeous. They are, icons of Christ. They are leading me home. They are leading me home. In terms of hagiography, so hagiography would be a word, as far as I know, to describe the life of a saint, often in a fairly highfalutin, wondrous manner, lots of signs and wonders. I like them. I smile slightly when I see in Irish and Welsh and Celtic, because that's my home ground. I do notice that a lot of the miracles that tend to turn up seem to be awfully influenced by what went on in the New Testament. Well, maybe that's just part of the signs and wonders of that time. I don't know. But I view them all in this amplified mythological consciousness that I've had for 30 years anyway. They are a great visual tapestry of all kinds of struggles and encounters we go through in our own lives all the time. So I say, good. And in this search for possibly more of the cosmic Christianity, the mystical Christianity, which I think is just front and center of all Christians, whatever your denomination, I think the saint stories and the hagiographies will be a great resource, but not at the expense of the Gospels. Where are we now? From Greg, what's the favourite book on your shelf right now? Our thoughts determine our lives. This is such a beautiful book and such a wonderful, kind, powerful, gracious spiritual teacher. Elder Thaddeus. This is a book, well, the clue's in the name. It's basically a book. Everybody, every teenager should have this book. It's a book about what you do with being neurotic and restless and frightened in this world when Christ tells you to have a peaceful heart. What on earth do you do with that? He has some clues. So I love that book. What else am I reading? I would be reading Pavel Florensky's Iconostasis. Funnily enough, talking about icons, I would be reading Pavel Florensky, A Quiet Genius by the wonderful Avril Pyman. Here's a good one. The Wilderness of God by Andrew Louth. Andrew Louth is still with us, and he is a very erudite Englishman, deep in orthodoxy, and has been writing about it in an extremely digestible and unpretentious but sophisticated manner for a long time. Anything by Andrew Louth is worth having. And then finally, I would say The Rivers North of the Future by The Testament of Ivan Illich. I've been reading Illich for a long time now, especially a book of his. You have to read this. You have to read this. And if you've been reading things like mine, like Scatterlings, this is one of the great fundaments of Scatterlings. In the Vineyard of the Text, a commentary to Hughes, I can't pronounce that, Didascalion or something like that. It's just tremendous. It's all to do with the movement from morality to literature within theological vellum inscribements. Really good. It's a book that would be a top 10 book. If I had to go off to a desert island, that would be one of the books I would go with. Okay, Isaac H. Many old stories from around the world share common themes, story arcs, and archetypes. Do you tend to think this is because of migration and person-to-person sharing? Do you think some of it is being drawn down from the collective unconscious, a la Dr. Jung? Is that a false dichotomy? Do you know, Isaac, I think that is the exact question that many years ago Bill Moyers asked Joseph Campbell on The Power of Myth. Seminal set of videos he made just before he died. So do the fact that stories, we find similar myths and stories all over the world, is that to do with cultures bumping into each other, or is it to do with the collective unconscious, that there are primordial images, to use that ghastly word, which I never use, if you notice, archetype, these things bubbling up under the surface? Well, that would make some of my Indigenous friends very uncomfortable indeed, and I can quite understand why. I think it is a bit garish to assume that a story about the Round Table is essentially the same thing as a myth pattern found in Arnhem Land from 5,000 years ago. That's a precarious route, I think, to follow that way. I would take a more less theory-laden approach. I'd like to take something more that I've just learnt in my own life now, which is that some stories have what I would call a nomadic agency to them, and some stories are place-based. Now, place-based story is a story that has a kind of, what we over here would call it a postcode or a zip code attached. It mentions specific things. There's a tree, there's a river, there's a bend, there's salmon, there's a certain things happen that are localized. Now, those are what you would call medicine stories, and they're not really to be told by people that aren't from that clan group or tribal group. But there are other stories that they seem to belong in what I would call a commons of the imagination. Fairy tales belong in a commons of the imagination, where you do find, there's a book called The Bear and His Sons, all about this, an seemingly identical story from, boreal Russia way over in bakingly hot Mexico. How's that happened? How are those stories talking to each other? It's very interesting. As I said, there's an argument for diffusion. There's an argument for the collective unconscious. I say stories, some of them have an agency to travel in the way that they do. Some want to stay very still. I know lots of local stories to me, lots of local stories to Dartmoor, but they do not work. I can tell them, but they just don't function right. Once I get out of the remit of Devon, they kind of fall on the ground, but as soon as they're here, they're pungent and vital again. One final thing I guess I would say about that. There's a big difference between a border and a frontier. I think there's a president of America that's very keen on borders, keeping people out. Frontiers are different. Storytellers are never border people. We're frontier people. And a frontier is a bit more rock and rolly, a bit more wobbly, a bit more gossipy than a border. And across a frontier, you get twists and turns of dialect and stories and information and things passing back and forth. That is, and this is a bit on the diffusion tip, how a lot of stories get passed. And that's when you often recognize at a border, you got the same stories, or you've got similar stories, which gives a bit of credence to Campbell's theory. But I don't know. I like to credit stories with a wee bit of their own agency, and they go where they will. And the best stories always have, as Augustine says, all truth is God's truth. So there's a bit of truth coming through them that just goes wherever truth is needed. All right, that's a bit of a ramble, but I hope that was okay for my first response to your questions. Send some in, and I'll see you here next time.